Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Renuka Thakore from the Center for Social Legal Studies at the University of Central Lancashire. I'm based in UK. I'm pleased to present you my thoughts on human rights and climate change. I will first introduce these two concepts, human rights and climate change, and then I will proceed to explain how it is related and what meaningful participation of primary beneficiaries of climate change can bring to this aspect. I mean, how they can provide or gain access to effective remedies. Human rights are universal legal guarantees that protect individual groups and peoples against actions and omissions, and therefore a state must provide or have a legal obligation. State means governments or local authorities have a legal obligation, and they must respect, protect, and provide a fulfill human rights and provide equal worth to all human beings. These human rights are equal, indivisible, and interrelated and interdependent, and cannot be waived or taken away. So furthermore, human rights are legally protected and impose obligations in relation to actions and omissions, particularly to the states and state actors. Climate change is also happening. You know that there are ample evidence now that it is real and impacts us directly and indirectly. Climate change affects all regions around the world. Polar ice shields are melting, the sea is rising, and in many regions, we can see that there is extreme weather impacts, events, and rainfall and other like fire and other things that are becoming common, which others may not have experienced directly, but generally it is seen in news, and we can understand that this is experienced in almost all parts of the world. In 2023, climate disasters claimed 12,000 lives globally, and therefore it is very important that we consider that how this climate change is negatively impacting the people's right to health, housing, water, and food. These negative impacts will increase exponentially as the degree of climate change increases. And therefore, we have to take care of it. We have to think of what are the remedies for this. And also, it will be disproportionately impacting on the individuals and the groups of people who are in vulnerable situations, including women, children, and persons, older persons and indigenous people, minorities, migrants, and many other people. This disaster impacts human rights. And states have an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill and promote all these rights. And their failure of not taking alternative measures to prevent these human rights in harms caused due to climate change breaches their obligation. And therefore, state must act to limit anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, and that is mitigate climate change, as well as introduce measures that can allow people to adapt and so on. They also have to introduce regulatory measures so that they can be controlled. And therefore, I think climate change affects people everywhere, and it is the right of the state to take care of it. With respect to climate change, states are obligated to prevent foreseen harms, as I already mentioned, and therefore according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms thereby can be fully realized, and everyone has duties to the communities. Similarly, this declaration also have that states should take steps individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially they should provide economic and technical instruments and available sources so that these communities can achieve able to achieve the benefits of the mechanisms that the state is developing and providing them. The Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, and the Future We Want, these all documents call for the right to development, which is articulated to the UN Declaration on the Right to Development, and to be fulfilled as to meet equitably the development and the environmental needs of present and future generation. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change calls for states to protect future generation and to take action on climate change on the basis of equity and in accordance to their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So it involves all human rights have a responsibility for development. It also says that all responsible actors should be held accountable for the negative impact of their activities. And therefore, everyone requires action to address and remedy the disproportionate impacts of the climate change, especially on the vulnerable, and reduce inequalities between that. We must all work to raise the concerns of climate justice, fairness, equity, and access to remedy. All persons who suffer human rights harms are entitled to access the effective remedy. And therefore, as we saw in the previous slide, that the impacts of climate change affect the vulnerable the most, and therefore equity in climate change requires the efforts to mitigate and adapt the impacts of climate change and benefit people in developing countries, indigenous people, people in vulnerable situation, and future generation. In spite of the saying that the state should commit for these things, the UNFCCC reports already identify that this has not been achieved so far. The states have been failing in providing and ensuring the implementation of adequate mitigation and adaptation controls or measures that can limit climate change and reduce the adverse effect on human rights, even the economy and the public health and environment. And therefore, I think human right, each and every individual, the citizens, must be aware of these human rights, and there should be a transparent participation and accountability process where each and every one as a citizen, but also can participate and then be a part of this solution. It is important to be participating in such basic human rights, and it is a precondition, or it is a catalyst for the realization and the enjoyment of other human rights. In order to ensure sustainable development. While I mention sustainable development, I cannot stop mentioning sustainable development goals. This is the current framework that allows us to have sustainable development pathways. It is developed in order that we can combat climate change, but also we can realize the development with social, economic, and environmental equity and development and equity. So here, the right of development and underscores that people must be at the central of the subject. They must be active participants and the beneficiary of the development. It articulates that the state and all persons having responsibilities for development and state should work individually and collectively, effectively, to create an international enabling environment for the development in which the benefits of development and equality are shared by everyone and all. So likewise, the right of food, which is SDG 2, zero hunger, demands the international community to take adequate climate action and address the single greatest threat to fulfillment of the right to food, and largely remains still unchecked. Now, the right of water and sanitation associated with SDG 6 highlights that the millions of people at the bottom of development pyramid are still exposed to various climate shocks. And when they are exposed, slow onset of disasters like, river erosion, desertification, groundwater contamination, these all impact their right of having good food, clean water and sanitation. And therefore, there is an urgent need for everyone to work to develop adequate standard of living that can be essential, that should be essential for everyone to enjoy. Also, this brings me to the right of health and associated with SDG 3, which is climate change has significant deterioration effects on human health and welfare. And therefore, we must decrease the potential harm to the waterborne disease, water or contamination and malnutrition, so that we can, stop increase in vector-borne diseases and heat-amplified levels of smoke and so on. And that is what leads to the ill health of many regions, and we have to stop that. And especially it is seen in developing countries with low income. And so this follows to the right of housing. We must provide adequate housing and it is a primary human right, and that should be exercised by the state and the interested parties, that they should create an environment that low carbon and sustainable housing is provided, or a basic need of housing is provided to each and every citizens. And finally, I would say that right to education associated with SDG 4 and even partly with the SDG 1 should be exercised and available and given free system, like instruments for enabling people to get this right. Because education can provide work and source of income. So the right to meaningful and informed participation guarantees all the persons the right of participation in public affairs and to vote, write, and get involved and contribute to and enjoy economic, social, and cultural, political development. And this right, it ensures that every person with disability or have access to political should have access to the political participation and rights on equal basis with others. Now, SEDEC is also used as a legal instrument articulated to the right of water and sanitation as to recognize that right of safe and clean water is provided to each and every human, and also especially here we are talking about women, where they have a special need uh, to secure that the water is available in the homes. And therefore, I think this implies that rural areas and the women and vulnerables are experiencing major impacts of water availability and supply, and that should be an urgent remedy for such problem. According to the World Bank report, 2 degrees Celsius average global increase in temperature may result into 1 to 2 billion people no longer having enough water to meet their needs. And therefore, we must act on these immediately to reduce our water use, which could be excess and could be considered as waste. But also we must increase the availability of water in such area and reduce burdens on the women and girls in developing countries who are responsible to fetch water. And therefore adequate facilities and infrastructure must be developed for the clean and clean water availability. Let me talk about now essential obligations and responsibilities of states and other duty bearers. And it is especially that they should be mitigating climate change and prevent its negative human rights impacts. What I mean by here that, as I already mentioned, but I reinstate that states have an obligation to respect, protect, fulfill, and promote all human rights for all persons without discrimination. And among these, it is climate change impact negatively that affects people's right to health, housing, water, and food, and exponentially decrease the degree of climate change that ultimately takes place and disproportionately affects individual groups and people in vulnerable situations, including women, children, older person, indigenous people, and so on. It also impacts, minorities, migrants, and rural workers, and persons with disabilities and poor, and therefore they should also be taken care. And we must limit anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases and introduce regulatory measures so that it can be prevented to going at a exponential rate and having negative impact to the society. The second one I will say is to ensure that all persons have the necessary capacity to adapt and climate change. So state must take care of building these skills, creating awareness, building the skills, and providing them instruments, putting them into the workplace that can allow contribution to reduce climate change. And that is where we have to work, recognizing the factors that induces positive climate change environment, but also recognizing the manner in which factors such as discrimination and disparity in education and health that affects the climate vulnerability and reduces the impact that has been done by the positive work. And so we have to devote adequate resources for the realization of these economic, social, and cultural rights of the person, while taking care that the negativity or negative aspects that are already in the society are not hindering it, but are reducing at the same time. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Compact of Civil and Political Rights, and other human rights instruments require states to guarantee these effective remedies for human rights violations. And therefore, we must be putting all the technologies or the skills and capabilities to reduce sea rise level, extreme weather events, and droughts, and that are affecting millions of people every year. And we must create a change environment, a systemic change that would divert these environmental harms into positive environmental ecosystem that can provide, ongoing services and products that human human capacity needs, or human lives needs. And state should be accountable to the rights holders for their contribution to the climate change, and they should induce these business positive climate change business positive strategies that can bring people on board and contribute to the positivity of this climate change. State must act individually as well as collectively, and they are obligated to mobilize and allocate the maximum available resources for the progressive realization of economic, social, cultural rights, as well as advancement of civic and political rights and the right of development. All these rights state are responsible for, and therefore they must mobilize the resources in a way that would allow this progression, this integration, and allow it against the climate change impacts. Meaning that they could introduce like innovative measures such as carbon taxes, appropriate safeguards of minimizing negative impacts on the poor, and realizing, internalizing, environmental externalities and mobilize additional resources. And also they must be putting financial instruments in a way that they can benefit the poor and the most marginalized people. Participation, business participation, digital participation, and many other things play a big role here in enabling effective, targeted, and human action to address climate change. And that is how we can achieve the total enjoyment or remedy for our human rights against climate change. And therefore, I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me. Together, we can make it happen. Thank you very much.